Good evening. Let's begin. I have just a few notes about the nature of prophecy. Someone was asking earlier, what do you think is the Gog of Gog and Magog, the king, or it says Nasi Rosh, the head president apparently of Meshech and Tuval? Is that Vladimir Putin? Well, I don't really know. I don't really know if I can know. I don't know why anybody wouldn't be interested in this. Although the idea of eschatology and if certain people who live in our day and age, or perhaps prominent wicked people who have lived in previous generations, could fit various explicit biblical prophecies about a Gog or what the sages refer to as an Armilus. One Mafarish translated as what we would know as an antichrist. Do these things even matter? And the answer is, I guess they do matter a little bit, but no one can really know. I'd like to address or bring up three issues with regards to prophecy, biblical prophecy. And once we have these rules in hand, we could begin to address these issues. So the first one is something that actually comes out from this week's Parsha, and that is that a prophecy only has its perfect meaning to us after the fact. That once it comes true, then we could actually work it out. And sometimes God Himself can change the rules of the game. And because He has promised something and said it in the prophecy, He can let it play out a different way in order to uphold the prophecy, as though He's obligated Himself, so to speak. And He has to make it come true. But sometimes it doesn't, people are not worthy of it if it's a good promise, so He has to delay it. The best example, like I said, is this week's parasha. God promised Abraham, "V'dor v'yi yashuvu hena." He promised him the land of Canaan, but not entirely to him. Abraham started selling land of Canaan. He became a great landowner. You are the Elohim, which would be a great leader, a prince of God. It's their expression saying just shy of a king because Abraham didn't wear a crown. But Abraham, who made war with other kings and had diplomatic relations with other ones, basically was on the level of a king. So he became a great man in the land of Canaan. But God promised him the land entirely to his fourth generation, Dor Revi'i Yeshuvu Hena, after being strangers in a land not their own and being oppressed. And if you're a careful reader of the book of Genesis, you'll see that that actually was supposed to come true to the exact fourth generation. Fourth generation from Abraham would be Jacob's sons. And they're the ones who came back from an oppression in exile, which wasn't so bad actually when you think about it, as their own grandfathers. So Lavan, Arami Oved Avi, Lavan tried to destroy everything. Uh, of course, it wasn't as bad as a Holocaust, and it certainly wasn't the Shibud Mitzrayim, but it was not the best. And they came back to the land of Israel, and they began to conquer the land and settle the land. But because of their infighting amongst the brothers, God changed the plan a little bit and sent them down to Egypt to suffer oppression for many years. And the prophecy came true in a different way. Similarly, when the people sinned, God told Moses, leave me alone. I'll destroy the people of Israel, and I'll make you into a great nation instead of them. Why do you have to promise them that? Because God had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that a great nation would come from them. So if He's going to destroy the people of Israel as we knew it back then He would have to somehow keep that promise by working with the sole survivor, with Moses, and making him to a great nation. And of course, we know that at the sin of the golden calf and at the sin of the spies, Moses intervened and prayed on the people's behalf and saved them. But you see that we come across this very important rule of prophecy. You only know how it's going to work out after it works out. So if you're sitting around saying, "Oh, I know the prophecy has to come true right now," or "I see it's going to come true perhaps sometime in the distant or near future, and here's how it's going to play out," you're very well going to be wrong. Why? Because you're going to know after it happens. Okay. Now we saw an example. The third example. The second rule. The bad does not have to happen. This is Jeremiah's rule. Jeremiah explaining how you to test a true prophet and expose a false prophet. And this is actually brought in greater detail by Maimonides in the laws of Yesodei Torah, explaining how the fundamentals of prophecy work. That is, the promises when promises of good are made by God, blessings of good fortune, good tidings, that has to come true. But if it's the bad, the Puranot, that doesn't, the Puranut, sorry, that does not have to come true. And just because a prophet enunciated doom and gloom, it doesn't mean it actually has to happen. And even if it does have to happen, perhaps it could be interpreted in the best possible way. For example, in the time leading up to the destruction of the first temple and the first commonwealth, the prophets had uh, told them that God has already decreed their suffering, the destruction of the temple, and the exile. In the times of Jeremiah, if the people had accepted the Babylonian oppression, perhaps it wouldn't have been so bad. Many would not have died. Perhaps it would have just been that the main people were taken into exile into Babylon, and the state was, I guess, the state was this was taken apart, and the temple was put out of service for a while. And because the people did not heed the prophet and accept the yoke of the Babylonians, instead it resulted in a bloodbath and the utter destruction of the temple. And even after that, they were given a second chance. Why do we have Tzom Gedalia? Because at a certain point, they had a chance to recover, and uh, so what could have happened? They could have recovered quite quickly. They still had a skeleton system and a little system of self governance, a little bit of autonomy, and the people ruined that. At least some of the people, and that's it. So it was the complete destruction of the people, and that's why we have a fast day, by the way, on Tzom Gedalia. The point is, the bad does not have to happen, and even if it does have to happen, it could be in the least bad way. Okay. Third, prophecy is less a prediction of the future and more of moral instruction. That's very important. You could keep looking. People can try. I think it's a fool's errand trying to match, let's say, what's contemporary happenings with what is promised or what is uh, predicted in the words of the prophets. People have been doing this for thousands of years. For example, they've been waiting for the Messiah to come, and unfortunately, one of the greatest tests and perhaps one of the most greatest misfortunes that have befallen us is when people were expecting Messiah to already show up. And what happens? He didn't show up. And yeah, then people went off the derech. Maimonides says this, others have also pointed this out. Instead, one should just have faith in God, try to keep the commandments of the Torah, serve God, have fear of heaven, and of course, study the Torah and hope and bring it about yourself. But it doesn't mean that it's going to happen necessarily in your days. Instead, it's less of a prediction of the future and more of moral instruction. That is, uh, you're supposed to act on the words of the prophet. The prophet's there to rebuke the people. That's his main goal. He's not supposed to come up with new ideas. He's supposed to correct their behavior. And when we have a prophecy, and this is lost on many people, especially nowadays, the last two generations with the advent of Zionism, uh, you're not supposed to just sit back and let and hope the prophecies happen. You actually have to do your part to make it happen. So it's a commandment. You have to let it come true. So we learned this from the prophet Nathan, who delivered the message to King David that Solomon would be his heir. So Nathan strove to make it actually happen, even though David had other sons who were rivals for the throne. So too, if God has told us that there's supposed to be a reconstitution of the Jewish nation in our days, and there's supposed to be uh, a Jewish state. There's supposed to be the ingathering of exiles and rebuilding the temple, etc. It's not good enough for us to just sit back, keep Shabbos and Kashrus and I guess in Lakewood and in Muncie and Buenos Aires, and hope that one day God will just bring it back to the land of Israel and everything will be hunky dory. It is our job to do our part to try to be in the land of Israel and try to keep those commandments also, especially the ones that have been defunct for some millennia even. It's our job to try to make that happen. So now with these rules and now understand these rules, we can look at this. Gomer and Magog. The names mentioned explicitly here in the book of Yechezkel, when they're first introduced in Sefer Bereshith. We just read about it last week. They're descendants of Noah. And more romantic scholars, especially of the last few hundred years, both Jew and Gentile alike, tried to find linguistic similarities between, let's say, a name like Meshech, They see, ooh, Moscow. And they see names like Ashkenaz, and they see Togarma and other things. And they try to say, well, Ashkenaz, because in the times of the Talmud already, that was referred to, they were referring to Germania as that Jews did, even though Germania is mentioned also explicitly already in Mishnaic times. So Germany's had its name for 2,000 years. Germany's been called Germany, at least when we pronounce the G as a hard G, among Jews since before the destruction of the temple. Yet Jews start calling it Ashkenaz. It doesn't mean that the Ashkenaz mentioned in the book of Genesis, which is apparently somewhere in the Middle East, like most of those other places mentioned. How far away do we get from the Middle East? Greece. Is Greece in the Middle East? Greece is mentioned explicitly in the book of Genesis. But is Ashkenaz what later known as Ashkenaz? Probably not. So too, most of those names have to be in an area that was at least known or well known to the biblical authors. So you are not going to have a place mentioned beyond the known world at the time. You're not going to have China and Australia and North America and South America, or even uh, the Europe beyond the Alps mentioned in Genesis. So it is not likely that Russia is the place that is explicitly mentioned here. Gomer, Magog, and Gog and Magog, etc. Those were seem to be places near the Caspian Sea, and uh, more honest attempts at identifying these places. You could look at it, for example, just the Sonsino. The Sonsino was the Chumash came out. It's pre-state. I think it's from the 1930s, so it's almost 90 years old now. As a Perush, he mentions it as the Scythians and the Cimmerians, etc. That seems to be a more honest approach. So, is it literally talking about them? I don't think so. However, and this is important, the sages themselves assume that these names are just stand-ins. These names are just there as I guess, proverbial barbarian tribes. Why? Because the point of the war of Gog and Magog, as the sages said explicitly, they said that God perhaps would have made uh, King Hezekiah the Messiah, so his apocalyptic war, his war of Gog and Magog, could have been fulfilled with the arrival of the Assyrian hordes. Assyria is Ashur. Ashur is one of the sons of Shem. He is one of the most prominent biblical nations that has always been clearly identified and well known to our people and to the entire world. So, how could the Assyrians become uh, the people of Magog, and how could their leader Sancheriv and Esarhaddon and the rest of those kings be identified with Gog? That's not their name at all. So sages say somehow after the fact, once it would have happened, it would have they would have realized, the prophecy came true. And this was a prophecy, by the way. Gog and Magog is mentioned explicitly where it's in Ezekiel, who is basically became a prophet right about the time of the destruction of the first temple, and Hezekiah lived more than a century before that. So you understand they always had this concept, but it doesn't mean that it has to come true exactly as it's there. You only understand it afterwards. So is Russia the proverbial lands? They're going to lead this confederation of nations against the people of Israel uh, at the end of days? Well, so far, no. Uh, However, if you do have a group that tries to do such a thing, then perhaps they would be. Many times in history, they thought that, this war happening, that's Gog and Magog. For example, a lot of the Crusades could have easily fit that. If the redemption had taken place, if the Jewish people were ready and pushed for it, then perhaps it would have happened in their days, but it didn't happen. However, and this is something that always gives me optimistic look at the book of Ezekiel, and that is you start seeing from chapter 36 and on. This is very important that the description of the great events that are to take place in in the messianic future, the times of redemption, seem to actually have taken place already, and that's kind of fortunate for us. For example, Maimonides describes all that's supposed to happen at the end of the days, the symptoms of redemption, the arrival of the Messiah, the ingathering of the exiles, the rebuilding of the temple, a new Jewish commonwealth, the elimination of idolatry throughout the world. Those are all wonderful things. Maimonides says no one really knows the order in which they'll take place. There are, like we said in previous shurim, it's kind of weird that great Jewish scholars insisted that the first thing be the arrival of Messiah. And before that, you can't have an ingathering of the exiles. Can't have a Jewish state. Can't have the building of the temple. You can't strive for any of these things. The chief rabbi even poskin this way. This is a Satmar position that you can't have this. You have to wait for the Messiah first. And the Maimonides says, yeah, the Messiah is one who gathers the exiles and eventually builds the temple. But he says, the next chapter, no one really knows the order in which all these things will happen. And it turns out we have been witnessed, thank God, in the past generations to see that first the ingathering of the exiles is supposed to happen. And who knows, maybe we'll succeed in rebuilding the temple before the Messiah shows up. God willing, maybe the Messiah will arrive perhaps tomorrow, just in time for the elections, about which we will have more to say in a minute. But the point is that you don't know how it was going to play out. And Maimonides points out you don't know the order, but we've had the merit to actually see some of these things actually do play out, and now we know some of the order. It's interestingly enough that if you follow Ezekiel now, start in chapter 36, in verse 32, he talks about the ingathering of exiles. And he says that that will be a sanctification of God's name, because the Israelites, the Jewish people persisting in the diaspora, is a desecration of his great name. The ingathering exiles will be God's great sanctification of his own name. So that's the first thing. And then he talks about settling the land. We shaftem ba'aretz asher natati lavotechem. You will sit in the land I gave to your ancestors. V'karati el hadagan v'rebeiti oto v'aten alechem ra'av. I will call to the grain, and I'll increase it, and I will not allow you to starve. V'rebeiti et pri haaretz utnuvasa taseh. And I will call to the fruit of the tree and to the yield of the field. So you see, God first predicts the ingathering exiles, and then agricultural renaissance. God will allow the land to provide for the people who live there. And the next paragraph says that they'll rebuild the destroyed cities, and they will settle those cities, and they'll build new fortifications. Well, my grandfather saw this come true. And then God says, next paragraph, that God will increase the population. What will he do? Arbeotam katson adam. And he says, just like sheep multiply, just fill the land with Jews. So what do we have here? Ingathering exiles, uh, the, the agricultural revolution, the building of the new cities, and then the population increase. And then he talks about the vision of the dry bones, the valley of the dry bones, which is a prophecy of the resurrection. A very important theological point here. We believe in the resurrection of the dead, but we believe in that in two ways. The physical resurrection of the dead, let's say people who have died hundreds of years ago, physically arriving suddenly right now, every single person who's ever lived, rising from the grave physically in this world, is not what we believe in. We believe that the resurrection of the dead is something that is entirely of the next world. That is a different reality altogether that has been prophesied as post-messianic. And it's not the place to get into all the details of that. Physical resurrection of every single dead person is not something that is going to happen in this reality. However, there's also the resurrection, as has been pointed out by the Vilna Gaon, the resurrection of the dead as a metaphor for the reconstitution of the Jewish nation and the Jewish state in the land of Israel. And that is exactly what we have seen today. I think I have previous videos explaining the Vilna Gaon saying this explicitly, that the destruction, well, he wrote this explicitly, the destruction of the temple was basically a decapitation of the Jewish people. And if you decapitate a body, so right there, it looks fresh, it's still basically alive. It was alive a second ago. And then the ravages of time basically cause decomposition, and eventually even the entire skeleton is gone and it's scattered to the wind. And the reversal of that is gathering up the bones, exactly as described here in Ezekiel, and then reconstituting the body around and the flesh around that until it is a completely whole body, and then it is reanimated, given its soul back, and then it comes back to life. And that is a mashal, for an allegory for the reconstitution of the Jewish nation. So the resurrection alluded to here is the rebirth of the Jewish nation, the founding of the state of Israel. And then the next prophecy is about Jewish reunification. Just like then, Ephraim and Yehuda were completely separated. Ephraim represents the northern tribes, Yehuda represents the southern tribes. They are the two dominant tribes. So too, God will bring them together one day. Jewish unification is the next stage. And that is what the stage basically where we find ourselves now. And then we have this war, Gog Magog, takes us over into chapter 38, a cataclysmic war, which, by the way, like I said, we hope if it has to happen, Doesn't have to happen because the prophecy of bad, only the good parts have to happen. But we do hope that if it does happen, it'll be in the easiest, the lightest interpretation possible. And who it involves, the sages don't really seem to care who steps into this role. Just like, by the way, Rabbi Soloveitchik and others point out, who steps into the role of a Malik doesn't have to be the physical descendants of a Malik. It could be whoever picks up the mantle. So in this case, we're not going to say that, oh, because these hordes came from the Far East or from North America, they don't fit the prophecy. I'm not saying I want the Chinese or the Americans to wage a great final apocalyptic war against the Jewish people in the land of Israel. I'm just saying that the sages didn't have a particular hakpadah, that it has to be particular people to fit the prophecy. And then the last prophecy he has, starting in chapter 40, is the rebuilding of the temple. So we've seen that these prophecies seem to be in a very natural order, and we've basically seen half of it already. We saw the kibbutz galiot, the rebirth of the agriculture here, the rebuilding of the cities, the population increase, the resurrection, the rebuilding of the state. We're having a little bit of a bump in the road with the Jewish reunification, and hopefully we'll skip the cataclysmic war part and go straight to the rebuilding of the temple. And in the rebuilding of the temple, it's assumed that there's already a Messiah. That's the Nasi. Uh, Although, if I were a little bit clear, I would perhaps say, Putin does fit this role of the king of Magog, Meshech, and Tuval, who is not referred to as king ever. He's referred to Nasi Rosh. So uh, I think his official title is president. So not king. Okay, so that's a little bit, but I don't really care. I certainly hope that God bless Putin and keep him far away. Like they say, and Fiddler on the Roof. We don't need people like that. Then again, we have our own Rishaim here in the land of Israel. We also hope that God keep them and bless them and keep them far away from us also, and that we actually have leadership that is fitting for our people. I'd like to close with this because the Israeli elections are tomorrow. I find it uh, enlightening, amusing, or it could just be a fantastic coincidence that a lot of the issues that are basically central to this upcoming election are alluded to in this week's parsha. The first is Lot and Abraham's dispute. This land was not big enough for the two of us. That's what it says. They had to split up. I don't get it. They can't just live in the north of Eretz Canaan, the south of Eretz Canaan. For whatever reason, Abraham decided they need to split. Sometimes an amicable separation might be in order. If you can't have a political system, two groups that don't get along, perhaps it's just good that they just split up. And although Abraham Lincoln felt that that's not the right way to go about these things, many of us have come to this realization, at least in our political philosophies, that instead of forcing such wildly disparate groups from having to cooperate and work with each other, just let them go their separate ways, and that sometimes is the best policy. And it says that Abraham offered Lot, Im yamina, yaminas be'ila. You take left, I'll go right. You take right, I'll go left. And it's interesting. In context, this means if you go north, I'll go south. If you go south, I'll go north. In the olden days, they used to call north and south just right and left because they would orient the map looking east. So left would be north, basically, if I'm not mistaken. And that's used explicitly in the next parasha, Asher Misamol Damasek, which is the left of Damascus. It means north of Damascus. And you have here, it's kind of interesting, an allusion to the general problem that people have when they vote here in Israel. You vote left, you get right. You vote right, you end up getting leftist policies. No one ends up happy here in Israel. And it says, Wayivchar lo Lot. Lot chose. Lot chose what? To go with the Sodomites. What was Sodom? It was a beautiful place. It looked really nice. Could be like the California back in the day. California is almost like a Gan Eden, except California is also sitting on a great natural fault line, just like Sodom, and eventually that spelled its doom. And Sodom gave its name to the main sin known for history. The Sodomites were basically the center of alphabet ideology back then. That's what they practiced. That was their way of life. So they just say this. Nowadays, alphabetism has become a way of life. It's almost a mitzvah. And no, it's the way of the Sodomites. It says they're ra'im v'chata'im la'Hashem ma'od. They're incredibly wicked. And Lot chose to go among these people, and that's wrong. So choose like Abraham. Let the Lots go with the alphabet people, which should be, instead of LGBT, I think it would be more appropriate to call it PPDD, which would stand for perverts, pedophiles, deviants, and degenerates. That's a much more accurate alphabetical description. And Lot chose that, and it was good for Abraham because he got to stay in Eretz Canaan, the land of Israel, and continue to serve God the way God wanted to. And then you suddenly have references that God will give this land at Tinena. How many times do you have in the parasha? Many times, God giving. Zarachana Tati, attain, I will give this land, and give and give. The name Netanyahu literally means God gave. And so there's a reference there. And lo and behold, Lapid is also here. What is there is Lapid, the pasuk which the fellow who wrote the Bible codes book after the fact. He had codes that apparently alluded to the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin back in, I think, what was it, 94, whatever it was. And of course, he only told people about this after the fact. All his Bible codes he found after the fact and didn't publish them beforehand and warn anybody because it was nonsense. But we have here a reference to Lapid. It says there was the birth ben Abitharim, Lapid Eish Asher Avar ben Agizrim Ha'eleh. Lapid Eish means a torch, okay, of fire that passed between the Gzarim. In this case, this is a reference to Lapid passing the threshold. Lapid Eish Asher Avar ben Agizrim Ha'eleh, but he's going to barely pass this time. It means that he's not going to have the. By the way, I'm not a prophet. I don't know. Perhaps it will work out the other way. It seems to be saying here that he's not going to. Lapid is not going to have. He's just going to pass, but he's ben Agzarim Ha'eleh. There's going to be a lot of groups that are not going to pass. It's like they're going to be cut off. Lapid's going to pass, but the smaller parties around him are not going to pass, and that's not going to help him. And of course, afterwards, you have Lizaracha Natati to Aretz Azot. Once again, God says He will give this land, and the reference to God giving, as we saw, is always a reference to Netanyahu. The last thing is the pregnancy of Hagar. Hagar gave her name to the Hagrim. Who were the Hagrim? The various tribes all descended from her, according to the sages. They identify Hagar with Keturah, which means that all of Abraham's sons, except for Isaac, were descendants of Hagar, chief among them Ishmael. And they all represent collectively the Arab world and the Muslim world. And in this case, it says, very interesting, Hagar, she fled from Sarah when she was pregnant. Remember, it was Sarah's idea to have her get impregnated. Perhaps, I don't know, maybe what was God's plan? It says it a few times in Sefer Bereshis that God made Ishmael so great because he was connected to Abraham. I'll make this Ben Amal great because he is your seed. And another verse like that, I don't have it in front of me right now. I do have it. I have listened to you regarding Ishmael. Abraham prayed for Ishmael. So what did God say? Wow, I blessed him. I have made him fruitful and I multiplied him. Very greatly. If 12, you will beget 12 Nisim, once again, great leaders, and I will make him a Goy Gadol. So it was Abraham himself in whose merit that the Ishmaelites became so great, even to this very day. Perhaps if they hadn't jumped the gun, Ishmael would not have been brought into this world, but we can't second guess these things. But when Ishmael was on his way, his mother was pregnant, she told the angel, we only have Gvir here. Ben Gvir is a reference to Yitzchak. He's the son of the Gvirah. Yishmael is the son of the Shifcha. So she says she's fleeing this ancestor, the paradigm ancestress of the Ishmaelites is saying that she's fleeing from her Gvirti. And the angel responds to Shuvi el Gvirteich v'hitani tachad yadeha. Go back to your Gvirah, which is masculine for your Gvir, and be afflicted underneath her hand. That is, give in to her. You should submit to Sarah, or Sarai in which case. And this basically became the case with the sons. Ishmael would have to acknowledge the mastery of the son of the Gvir. And perhaps that's also a lesson. Perhaps the Ishmaelites in this election should learn to give in to the fellow whose name best befits this. But this is all just a guess. That's why I'm putting this out before the elections. I don't know what will happen. Uh, I do know one thing. I've seen many arguments against voting for various uh, political parties. That's true. I've seen good arguments against voting for every single political party. There's not one party you should be voting for because every one of them has a problem. There's a good reason they betrayed us in the past. We've had a rapid succession of elections. What are they supposed to be every 4 years? Every single one of these parties, I have a good argument. You can't vote for this party because X, Y, and Z. That's 100% true. And that means there are no parties left for whom we are left to vote. So we're just stuck now, and we can only pray. We can pray to God that He send us proper leadership, that we become worthy of proper leadership, that we learn to find proper leaders, and not the frauds and clowns, basically, that we're left with today. Uh, Cheap replacements for proper leadership here in the land of Israel. And I don't know, perhaps these references won't play out, but it's a good thing to see. Thank you. Don't forget, send your questions and comments. And God willing, tomorrow we'll only hear the Seroth Tovot.